Have you ever shared good news with someone, genuinely good news, and watched their congratulations arrive a half-second too late? A smile that didn't quite reach the way it should have. You probably told yourself you imagined it. You probably moved on quickly, because naming it out loud felt petty, or paranoid, or unfair to someone who technically said all the right words. But some part of you noticed, and that part was picking up on something real. Carl Jung would have said, the discomfort you sensed in that moment wasn't really about you at all. It was the sound of something old and unresolved, stirring in the other person, something your good news had accidentally reached into without meaning to. Number 1. Envy isn't really about what you have. It's about what someone else's success reveals they don't. Most people assume envy is simple, wanting what another person has. But Jung's understanding of the psyche points to something more specific and more uncomfortable underneath that surface explanation. Envy tends to surface most sharply, not when someone gets something you merely want, but when their success illuminates a path you once wanted for yourself and quietly abandoned. Sometimes so long ago, you've stopped consciously remembering you ever wanted it at all. There was a woman I'll call Renata, who found herself strangely unsettled every time a former colleague posted about her growing creative business online. Renata told herself it was simple comparison, nothing deeper. But when she sat honestly with the feeling, she remembered something she'd buried years earlier, her own abandoned attempt at something similar, quietly shelved after a single discouraging comment from a family member. Her colleague's visible success wasn't threatening because Renata begrudged her happiness. It was threatening because it stood as living proof that the path Renata had quietly given up on had actually been walkable the entire time. Jung wrote, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." Envy, more than almost any other reaction, follows this rule precisely. Number 2. What can't be consciously admitted gets unconsciously projected, and that's exactly why envy so rarely announces itself honestly. Here's where this gets genuinely tricky to notice in real time. Very few people consciously think to themselves, I envy this person. Envy tends to feel shameful enough that most people won't allow themselves to experience it directly. So instead of surfacing as envy, it gets quietly transformed into something that feels more acceptable to think and say out loud. Suspicion, criticism, a vague sense that the other person has somehow changed, or become insufferable, or doesn't deserve what they've gotten, as much as they seem to believe they do. Jung called this mechanism projection, placing uncomfortable inner material outward onto someone else, because it's far easier to find fault with them than to sit with an unflattering truth about yourself. A friend's promotion becomes evidence they're suddenly full of themselves. A sibling's happy relationship becomes proof they're naive or performing for social media. None of these interpretations are really about the other person's actual character. They're a socially acceptable disguise for a feeling that would be much harder to admit plainly, I wanted that too, and I don't know what to do with the fact that I don't have it. If you've ever caught a critical thought about someone's success arriving suspiciously fast, before you'd even had time to genuinely evaluate the situation, leave a word in the comments for what you think that quick judgment might have actually been protecting you from feeling. Number 3. Someone else's growth can feel like an accusation, even when nothing was said, because it exposes a comparison you weren't ready to make. This is one of the more painful mechanics behind why certain people seem to grow distant the moment you start doing well, even people who genuinely cared about you before your circumstances changed. Jung believed that when someone close to you begins visibly living out a version of courage, ambition, or change that they themselves have avoided, your presence stops feeling neutral. It starts to feel, however unconsciously, like a quiet indictment of the choices they haven't made. This isn't really about you at all, even though it lands squarely on you. It's about the uncomfortable gap between the life someone is actually living and the life some part of them still privately wishes they were living instead. Your growth doesn't create that gap. It simply makes it impossible to keep ignoring. There was a man I'll call Julius, who noticed a close friend growing steadily colder after Julius finally left a stagnant job to pursue something riskier and, eventually, far more fulfilling. The friend never openly criticized the decision. He simply stopped asking about it, stopped celebrating small updates the way he once might have. Years later, that same friend admitted, almost offhandedly, that watching Julius take the leap had made his own unexamined stagnation impossible to keep pretending he was fine with. Number 4. The persona, the image someone works hard to maintain, often can't survive being visibly outperformed, so it defends itself by minimizing what threatens it. Jung described the persona as the mask carefully built to be acceptable, competent, admirable in the eyes of others. For people who've invested heavily in appearing to have things figured out, another person's clear, visible success can feel like a direct threat to that carefully maintained image, even when the two situations have nothing actually to do with each other. If someone's entire sense of stability depends on being seen as the capable one, the successful one, the one who's ahead, then someone else's win can register almost as a small demotion, not because anything was taken from them, but because the story they'd built about their own position suddenly requires a little more effort to maintain. This is often where the minimizing language comes from. They got lucky. It's not that impressive if you actually look closely. They're probably struggling behind the scenes. None of this reflects the truth of the situation. It reflects an urgent, unconscious need to protect a fragile self-image from information that makes it harder to sustain. Jung believed the persona was never meant to be mistaken for the whole self, and moments like this reveal exactly why that confusion becomes so costly. When your image of yourself depends on comparison, everyone else's good news becomes, in some small way, a threat that has to be managed. Number 5. What actually determines whether someone can be happy for you isn't how much they care about you. It's how much they've made peace with themselves. This might be the most important distinction in all of this, and the one that finally removes the sting of taking it personally. A person's ability to celebrate someone else's success without a flicker of resentment underneath it has very little to do with how much affection they hold for that person, and almost everything to do with how settled they are internally. Someone who has genuinely made peace with their own path, including its disappointments, its slower timelines, its abandoned attempts, tends to experience other people's success as simply good news, nothing more complicated required. But someone still quietly at war with unmet longing of their own will struggle to hold that same lightness, no matter how much they love you, because your success keeps brushing up against something in them that hasn't been resolved yet. Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." People who are actively engaged in that process, honestly reckoning with their own unlived potential, rather than avoiding it, tend to make remarkably generous witnesses to other people's growth. People who are still avoiding that reckoning often can't, not because they're cruel, but because they haven't yet done the harder, quieter work your success is inadvertently reminding them they still need to do. Number 6. And this cuts both ways, because the same mechanism explains your own reactions to other people's success too. It would be incomplete to talk about this only as something that happens to you. Jung's psychology asks something less comfortable of anyone paying close attention, to turn the same lens honestly on yourself. The next time someone else's good news produces an unexpected flicker of irritation, comparison, or a strange urge to find the flaw in their situation, that reaction is worth genuine curiosity, rather than immediate dismissal or shame. It isn't proof you're a bad person. It's information, pointing directly at something you may have quietly given up on, without ever fully processing the loss. Jung believed that what goes unacknowledged in ourselves doesn't disappear. It simply finds indirect ways to surface, and envy is one of its most common disguises. The people who eventually learn to feel real, uncomplicated happiness for others aren't the ones who never feel envy at all. They're the ones who've learned to notice it honestly, sit with what it's actually pointing toward, and use that information rather than projecting it outward onto whoever happened to remind them of it. If any part of this reached something you've felt but never quite named, whether from someone else's reaction to your success or your own reaction to theirs, share it with someone who might recognize it too. And if you'd like to keep exploring these patterns together, subscribe to the channel. Sometimes the people who struggle to celebrate you aren't struggling with you at all. They're struggling with a version of themselves they haven't made peace with yet.